Flight attendant gave bathroom cleaner to a black CEO. Instead of water, 10 minutes later. All shocked, the smell hit him first sharp sterile like a janitor's closet. Jonathan Price, CEO of one of the most valuable fintech companies in America, had asked for water. What he got instead was a bottle of clear liquid handed to him by a smirking flight attendant, followed by muffled laughter from the crew galley. At 37,000 feet in the first-class cabin of Flight 762, Jonathan twisted open the cap, parched from hours of meetings, and took a sip. The burning hit instantly, chemical acidic, unmistakably not water. He gagged, eyes widening as he looked up to see the attendant watching him with open amusement. "Just a little prank, sir," the man said with a mock salute. Passengers nearby glanced over confused. Some chuckled. Others ignored it entirely. But to Jonathan, that moment wasn't funny. It was war. Because in that single sip, they didn't just mock a man. They underestimated a legacy. What followed in the next 10 minutes would shake an entire airline and leave the world stunned. If you believe no black person should ever be treated like this, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that expose the truth. The chemical burn lingered in the back of Jonathan Price's throat long after the taste faded. His composure, however, never cracked. He sat perfectly still in his first-class seat, the sleek leather digging into his back as he stared forward, unblinking, unmoving, while the flight attendant strolled down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Behind the smile etched on Jonathan's face was a fire simmering quietly. Not from rage, but from restraint. He had lived his life as a black man in boardrooms, where one wrong tone, one flash of anger was all it took to be branded unprofessional. He had mastered calm, and right now calm was his most dangerous weapon. He recapped the bottle slowly and set it on the tray table. The label, when he examined it, wasn't even properly removed. It clearly read, "Disinfecting Surface Cleaner," the kind stocked in airplane lavatories. The blue font, the warning icons all intact. The attendants knew exactly what they were doing. Jonathan glanced sideways. A woman across the aisle caught his eye for a moment, then looked away, pretending not to see. Another man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling his headphones back on. No one asked questions. No one intervened. This was first class, where silence was more valuable than justice. He pressed the call button again. This time, a different attendant arrived, young, nervous eyes darting like a deer caught in headlights. She leaned in politely. "Is everything all right, sir?" Jonathan's voice was calm but piercing. "You might want to take that bottle back to the galley and ask your colleague what he thought was funny about it." Her eyes widened as she took the bottle, her smile faltering. I'll look into that, sir." He nodded once and dismissed her with a glance. When she left, Jonathan exhaled shallow and steady. He reached into his carry-on and retrieved a small leather-bound notebook. He flipped to a blank page and began writing in precise block letters. Flight 762, 11:46 a.m., requested water. 11:50 a.m., received disinfectant cleaner labeled bottle. Flight attendant, white male approx. 6'2", buzzed, haircut, navy tie. Smirked, laughed. The pen scratched the paper like a scalpel, methodical, exact, clinical. He wasn't just documenting, he was preparing. As he wrote, his mind split itself into compartments. One focused on the present body, still expression, neutral. The other retreated into his memory. How many times had he been here before? Not in the sky, not with cleaner in a water bottle, but in situations where humiliation was brushed off as miscommunication, where bias was hidden beneath professional courtesy. From the investment banker who asked him to repeat his job title 3 times in disbelief, to the client who assumed he was the driver. Every moment of that pattern, ignored, excuse swallowed, had brought him here. Jonathan had learned to carry his wounds in silence, but this time was different. The laughter, the bottle, the total absence of consequence. He looked over again. The attendant, Brent, he recalled from the name tag, was now speaking to another white passenger, grinning easily, pouring champagne. He was completely unbothered. Minutes later, the young female attendant returned with a bottle of real water. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it over. "I apologize for the confusion, sir. It was a mix-up." Jonathan tilted his head, studying her. "Do you believe that?" She blinked. "Sir, that it was a mix-up." She hesitated. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the galley, then back to him. I'm not sure. That was enough, not the words, her expression. She knew. Jonathan took the water but didn't drink it. He simply placed it on the tray unopened. The trust was already gone. He didn't press charges mid-flight, didn't cause a scene. He knew the game. Disrupting the calm of first class could easily become his indictment. Unruly passenger, aggressive behavior, no context, just headlines. So he sat composed, quietly humiliated before a dozen watching eyes who pretended not to see. But humiliation is a tricky thing. It doesn't always hollow you. Sometimes it sharpens you. 30 minutes later, as the plane began its descent, Jonathan folded his notebook, slipped it back into his bag, and checked his phone. No signal yet, but soon. And when he landed, silence would not be his response. The curtain to the galley remained closed. He didn't need to look back. They had no idea who they were laughing at. The wheels touched down with a soft screech at Logan International, and the cabin erupted in polite applause and an automatic reaction from the passengers who had no idea they had just witnessed a moment that would soon redefine their airline's future. Jonathan Price didn't clap. He didn't move. He sat still, eyes forward, hands resting on the armrest like a king observing a battlefield, not in anger but in calculation. When the fasten seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, he rose slowly. He didn't bother with overhead bins. His carry-on was already at his side. As he stepped into the aisle, his gaze passed directly over Brent, the same attendant who had served him that bottle of cleaner. Their eyes locked for a single breath. Brent's smirk had vanished. Now there was only discomfort, thinly veiled behind forced professionalism. "Have a good day, sir," he muttered. Jonathan paused just long enough to make it clear he heard and didn't accept. Then he walked off the plane. Outside the gate, the noise of the terminal returned, boarding calls, rolling luggage, the low hum of airport life. But Jonathan barely heard it. As he moved through the terminal with long, even strides, he tapped the screen of his phone, then brought it to his ear. "Savannah," he said, "I need you to lock my schedule for the next 72 hours. Cancel the Wycliffe dinner and the Zenith call." His assistant didn't even ask why. "Understood. Do you need a car?" "Already in motion," he replied. "Also, send a compliance team to audit Airbridge's vendor contracts. Every supplier, every invoice. Start with whoever supplies their onboard sanitation products." He hung up before she could respond. By the time he reached the private exit, a sleek black SUV had already pulled up. The driver nodded. "Mr. Price, welcome back to Boston." "Thank you." Jonathan slid in, shut the door behind him, and let the city disappear behind tinted glass. At the heart of downtown Boston, atop the 48th floor of the Concordia building, sat the headquarters of Veritas Holdings, Jonathan Price's empire. Spanning real estate data, infrastructure, and aviation logistics, Veritas was one of the most quietly powerful conglomerates in the country. Its fingerprints were on everything from airport Wi-Fi contracts to the architecture of airline loyalty programs. Jonathan stepped into the boardroom like a conductor entering his orchestra pit. Seated around the table were his inner circle heads of legal, communications, compliance, and finance. No one had to ask why they were there. The email he had sent 30 minutes after landing had said it all: incident in transit. Begin an internal recon on Airbridge Airlines. Assume public exposure within 96 hours. Prepare contingency acquisitions strategy. No further details. He didn't need to explain. They'd been with him long enough to recognize the tone. This wasn't personal. It was structural. "Update me," Jonathan said as he took a seat. Lena Cross, head of compliance, leaned forward first. "We've already cross-referenced Airbridge's product suppliers with FAA compliance databases. Early signs show 3 flagged warnings in the past 5 years. 2 for mislabeled materials, 1 for improper crew training." Jonathan nodded once. "And the chemical, I was given a compound known as Enviro-Sans-Surface B12. Used exclusively for bathroom disinfection?" Lena replied, her face pale. "Extremely unsafe for consumption. We pulled its manifest. It was delivered 3 days ago to their Atlanta warehouse." "Do we have security footage?" he asked, already requested. "Waiting on a subpoena." "Skip it," Jonathan said flatly. "Call Malcolm over at SafeNet Security. They manage the cameras for that facility. He owes me a favor." Lena blinked. "You're moving fast." Jonathan turned to her, voice low and calm. "They tried to humiliate me in the sky, so now we bring them back to earth." By nightfall, his legal team had drafted the first motion. Not a lawsuit, not yet. First, a formal cease and desist letter demanding a public apology and disclosure of all internal complaints filed against Brent Walker and any crew members involved. Attached were stills from the in-flight footage shot covertly from Jonathan's own lapel cam, a backup cam he wore on all business flights after years of knowing that in corporate aviation documentation was power. "I want them to see that I've been prepared for this since the moment they smiled in my face," he told Marcus, his chief legal strategist. Elsewhere across the city in a penthouse suite, a different conversation was unfolding. Three Airbridge executives sat around a private dining table, wine half-finished, the news of Jonathan's letter having just reached them. "Why the hell is he making noise?" one grumbled. "We've served thousands of passengers. We don't need this kind of attention." Another executive checked his phone, scrolling through an internal staff memo. "You don't understand. That man runs Veritas Holdings. His company built half the software our airline uses. If he wants to tear us apart, he can." Silence fell. The smirks were gone now, replaced by the first taste of fear. Because what they didn't know, sitting smugly in their wine-soaked denial, was that Jonathan Price didn't just have power, he had the receipts, and tomorrow the world would see them. The boardroom at Veritas Holdings was quiet the next morning, but beneath the silence, tension simmered. Jonathan stood at the head of the table with a remote in his hand, watching the large screen as it displayed a timeline of infractions committed by Airbridge Airlines. Each incident was marked in red, spanning nearly a decade. Discrimination complaints, mishandled passenger grievances, settlement payouts kept confidential through legal non-disclosure agreements. 10 years of rot, he said, his voice level but cutting. And no one said a thing. He turned to Marcus. "Give me the summary." Marcus cleared his throat, tapping his tablet. "We've identified at least 17 formally documented cases of racial discrimination or hostile conduct involving Black or minority passengers. Most were settled out of court. Several included confidentiality clauses that prevented public exposure." And internally, Lena chimed in, her tone sharper than usual. 5 whistleblower memos sent to HR, 2 from pilots, 1 from a gate agent, 2 from flight attendants, all ignored. One of those whistleblowers was later reassigned to night freight routes in Alaska. Silent retaliation. Jonathan absorbed it, then looked to Clara, head of PR. "How's the public sentiment tracking?" Clara hesitated. "Mixed right now. Some outrage from civil rights groups and independent journalists, but the mainstream press is cautious. The airline statement is doing damage control. They're leaning on the isolated incident narrative." "Of course they are," Jonathan muttered. He walked slowly across the room, thinking. "The damage is layered," Marcus added. "This isn't just a rogue employee. It's a culture where misconduct is minimized, where crew bias is protected by bureaucracy. They're insulated on purpose." Jonathan looked at the timeline again. Then he turned and addressed the room. "Then we tear down the insulation." Across town, in a sunlit corporate suite overlooking the Charles River, Richard Hammond, the airline's COO, read Jonathan's letter for the third time. The words weren't angry, they were worse. They were cold, precise, and full of evidence. "He has video," he muttered aloud. "Clear video." His assistant looked up. "Sir, nothing. Cancel my lunch meeting." Inside his gut, a twisting knot was forming. That knot only grew tighter when the morning headlines broke across the finance wires. Veritas CEO hints at action against Airbridge Airlines, allegations of racial misconduct surface amidst industry silence. The bottle was a warning. Jonathan Price files formal demand for accountability. Richard swore under his breath. In a hurried emergency meeting with the airline's general counsel and crisis team, options were tossed on the table like damp cards: issue a deeper apology, suspend the flight attendant, donate to a civil rights nonprofit. But someone in the room finally said what none of them wanted to hear. This might not be containable. Back at Veritas, Jonathan was already 5 steps ahead. He called in an external audit firm. Not just any firm, but Tryman Group, a forensic accounting and ethics compliance powerhouse known for exposing billion-dollar corruption inside pharma tech and logistics firms. Their mission was clear: dig through Airbridge's procurement records, employee contracts, crew evaluations, and internal HR escalations, and dig deep. Meanwhile, Jonathan arranged confidential meetings with 3 Airbridge employees who had reached out through an encrypted tip line set up by his team. They met at a co-working space rented under an alias. No cameras, phones off, One was a senior crew trainer named Elise, middle-aged, weary eyes, clasped hands that trembled slightly as she began. I trained Brent Walker, she said. He's been reported twice before. Once for calling a black family and first-class ticket lottery winners under his breath. Another time for denying water to a teenager because he looked aggressive. Both times HR said it was personality conflict. Jonathan didn't flinch. Did he receive any corrective training? She shook her head. No, in fact, he was promoted to head cabin lead on international flights 6 months later. The second witness, a young gate agent named Javier, revealed the coded language often used behind the scenes. Phrases like premium shuffle and zone checks, they're not official. They're just excuses to move people of color out of the premium zones without ever saying it out loud. Jonathan leaned back, hands steepled. He didn't need theatrics. The truth was ugly enough. The third witness, however, was the most devastating. He was an HR contractor who had access to the airline's internal complaint resolution system. They tagged cases, he said, internal codes. D-class means difficult passenger. But a lot of black passengers were preemptively coded as D-class after boarding even if no incident occurred. Jonathan stared at him. You're telling me the system marks passengers based on a racial assumption? The man nodded slowly, not explicitly, but it's there, in who gets coded and who doesn't. Jonathan stood. This isn't just misconduct, he said. It's infrastructure, prejudice built into the bones of the company. That night alone in his penthouse office, Jonathan looked out over Boston. The city lights glittered like broken glass, reflecting both brilliance and danger. He thought of the bottle, the burn in his throat, and the silence from the other passengers. He remembered how no one had looked up, how nobody had asked if he was okay. Because in their world, the humiliation of a black man wasn't extraordinary. It was invisible, but not anymore. Now the invisible would be seen, documented, exposed, and burned down system by system. At 38,000 feet above sea level, silence could be a powerful accomplice. That day on Flight 607, dozens of passengers had sat within earshot of Jonathan Price when he sipped the toxic cleaner. None of them had spoken up. Not during the moment, not in the days that followed. But silence had a way of echoing. It was Ava Nguyen who broke first. A software executive returning from a conference, she had been seated across the aisle from Jonathan. She hadn't just seen the incident, she had filmed it. And for days, she debated whether to say anything. On the fifth morning after the flight, she opened her encrypted email and sent a message to the address she'd seen in a recent article about Jonathan Price's investigation. I was there, I have footage, and I can't stay quiet anymore. That video, blurred slightly but undeniable, showed the attendant grinning as he handed the bottle to Jonathan. It showed the way Jonathan recoiled, coughed, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. And worst of all, it captured a faint but chilling sound, laughter from the galley. Jonathan received the video late at night. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He forwarded it directly to his legal counsel and said, "We now have the catalyst." Ava wasn't alone. In the days following her message, a ripple of conscience moved through the cabin's passengers. Another man, a retired school principal named Howard McClellan, wrote in next. His statement was simple but damning. I saw the attendant hand him the bottle. I remember the look on Mr. Price's face after the first sip. And I remember pretending to sleep so I wouldn't have to get involved. His voice cracked during his in-person deposition. I was a coward, he admitted. I thought if I said something, I'd be dragged into something messy. But what he went through, I see now that my silence helped them. Howard offered more than guilt. He had captured a series of screenshots from the airline's in-flight entertainment system, which showed that shortly after the incident, Jonathan's seat was mysteriously flagged as potential threat, disabling his meal options and call button. The airline had claimed it was a software glitch. It wasn't. But perhaps the most unexpected voice came from within the airline itself. Her name was Aisha Reynolds, a mid-level customer care manager. She'd worked for Airbridge for nearly 11 years, moving through departments, always careful, always quiet. But when the Jonathan Price case surfaced, she couldn't ignore the patterns any longer. I'm tired of covering things up, she told the independent review board. We've buried too many cases like his, not as extreme, but definitely rooted in bias. Aisha provided internal chat logs where managers joked about entitled passengers with DEI syndrome, a thinly veiled jab at minority travelers who complained. Her most damning evidence came in the form of a redacted memo from 3 years prior, in which she herself had warned leadership that subtle discrimination among senior cabin crew is rising and being met with passive tolerance. She had been ignored. Mr. Price is the first person with enough power to drag this into daylight, Aisha said, tears brimming. But I want to help make sure he's not the last. As the statements poured in, Jonathan's legal team compiled them into a single briefing. They called it the Passenger Reckoning. They printed it in black leather-bound copies and shipped it to the Department of Transportation, the FAA's ethics office, and every member of the Senate Subcommittee on Transportation Oversight. At the front of each packet, one sentence was embossed in silver ink: "Justice only begins when silence ends." Inside Veritas headquarters, the atmosphere was shifting. The momentum was no longer theoretical. It was kinetic. It was personal. Jonathan gathered his closest allies in the strategy room. "We're not just fighting a case," he told them. "We're unfreezing a society trained to look away." A hush fell over the table. No one looked at their phones. Marcus finally broke the silence. "So what's next?" Jonathan's eyes burned with clarity. "We move from witnesses to whistleblowers." By the next day, 2 more Airbridge employees had come forward. One was a former regional manager who admitted he was told to prioritize white passengers on standby upgrade lists. The other was a new hire, a Latina gate agent, who had been coached to triple-check passports of ethnically ambiguous travelers. The company's firewall was breaking. Backlash, of course, came fast. The airline's executive team released another video apology, slicker this time, with emotional music, diverse actors, and promises of reform. But beneath the PR campaign, internal chaos reigned. Executives held frantic Zoom calls as their investor relations team fielded inquiries from pension funds and asset managers concerned about ethics exposure. Stock began to slide. Quiet resignations followed, and still more voices came forward. Because once truth is spoken aloud without apology, it becomes harder to ignore, especially when a man like Jonathan Price doesn't let it go quiet again. Jonathan Price sat alone in a soundproof conference room, staring at a whiteboard covered with names, arrows, and question marks. The evidence they had now wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. He didn't want a headline. He wanted a blueprint for conviction. Pattern. "We need undeniable pattern," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Across from him, Marcus Reed nodded, flipping open a leather binder marked Internal Affairs. They had video footage, eyewitness testimony, and whistleblower reports. But Jonathan knew how corporations survive scandals by denying structure, blaming individuals, and offering settlements with airtight NDAs. They couldn't allow that to happen here. "We need to go deeper," Jonathan said. "Contracts, suppliers, training records. We dig until we hit the marrow." The investigation team was expanded overnight. 2 former airline compliance officers were brought on, both under NDA and vetted through a trusted civil rights network. A team of forensic accountants joined next, tasked with reviewing procurement data and operational logs. Jonathan spared no expense, hiring not just lawyers but data engineers and metadata analysts. Every flight manifest, every maintenance check, every staffing assignment involving the accused crew was pulled and mapped. Within 72 hours, patterns emerged. Flight attendant Lucas Mahoney, the man who handed Jonathan the contaminated bottle, had served on 112 flights over the past 2 years. On 26 of those, passenger complaints had been quietly closed without resolution. Of those 26, 21 involved black passengers or those with traditionally ethnic names. The wording in the reports repeated eerily: non-compliant with crew instruction, aggressive tone, questioned service protocol. All of them followed the same pattern: complaint, deflection, silence. The smoking gun came in the form of a redacted memo retrieved from a misfiled HR folder by one of the forensic investigators. The document, dated 14 months before Jonathan's flight, outlined a formal inquiry into Mahoney's behavior initiated after a customer incident in Miami. The conclusion was chilling. Though crew member demonstrated poor judgment, termination may invite legal scrutiny. Recommend reassignment to lower profile routes and observation. They hadn't fixed the problem. They'd reassigned it. Meanwhile, Marcus Diaz and his legal interns dove into court records, uncovering 4 previous discrimination-related complaints filed against Airbridge Airlines over the past 5 years, all settled quietly. But buried in each settlement was a clause granting the plaintiffs access to training audit results from the airline. Using that clause, they filed for discovery. What came back was damning. For years, the airline's bias training had consisted of 12-minute digital videos viewed on crew iPads. There was no testing, no certification, and in some cases, no record of completion. One slide simply read, "Be aware of differences. Don't let them interfere with service." Jonathan stared at the screen when he saw it. His jaw clenched. That's not training. That's wallpaper. As the evidence mounted, Jonathan's team shifted strategies. It was no longer just about winning a case. It was about building a case that no one, no judge, no jury, no boardroom could look away from. They began constructing an interactive database, the Airbridge file. It included a digital map showing complaint clusters by route and crew, timeline overlays of incident reports, whistleblower tips and internal memos, a searchable archive of passenger testimonies and redacted training records. Journalists were granted encrypted access. So were senators. So were regulators. And then came the leak. Someone from inside Airbridge sent Jonathan's team a copy of an internal Slack message sent the day after the contaminated bottle incident. It read, "Need to squash this ASAP. PR is on standby. Legal says do not confirm the cleaner bottle. Say unlabeled beverage. Keep it vague." The message was time-stamped. The sender, a senior VP of brand risk management. The term unlabeled beverage would appear in every public statement the airline gave over the following 2 months. Jonathan highlighted the line with a red Sharpie. "This," he said, "is your intentional cover-up." Amid all of this, he didn't forget the human stories. A mother reached out from Detroit sharing that her teenage son had been denied boarding after a crew member claimed he didn't match the profile on the ID. He had a valid student license and a boarding pass. He'd flown alone before. No explanation. Just told to step aside and eventually put on standby. A teacher from Atlanta described a flight where she was escorted off mid-board for causing a disruption. Her disruption. Asking why her seat assignment had been changed from first class to economy despite having paid extra. The flight attendant who made the change, Mahoney. Each story added a human heartbeat to the cold, hard data. Jonathan didn't just read them. He called every single person back. They needed to know someone was listening. One evening just before midnight, Jonathan sat at the edge of his bed, phone in hand, reviewing the final composite report. There were over 100 pages of documentation, now over 40 separate testimonies, 13 video files, and 3 former employees willing to testify. "Are you ready?" Marcus texted. Jonathan replied with a single word, "Yes." Then he sent one more message to the one person who hadn't yet spoken. "Lucas Mahoney, you have 48 hours. Come forward, tell the truth, and cooperate, or this report is going public without you." He didn't expect a response, but what happened next would shake the entire case wide open. The reply came at 2:14 a.m., a single message from a burner number with no name. "Meet me. One time. No lawyers. I'll talk." Jonathan stared at the glowing screen, thumb hovering over the reply button. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat in silence, letting the weight of the message settle. Lucas Mahoney, flight attendant, central perpetrator, and potential key witness, was reaching out. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was something. By 9 a.m., Jonathan's private security consultant had traced the burner phone to a small motel just outside city limits. Room 206, cash-only booking, cameras disabled. It screamed guilt and desperation. Marcus Diaz wasn't pleased. "It's a trap or a PR setup. This guy could be fishing, trying to discredit you." Jonathan stood firm. "Then let's be 2 moves ahead. If he talks, we tape it. If he lies, we burn him in court." They agreed to the meeting under tight security. Hidden mics, legal observers stationed nearby. One chance to flip the narrative. The motel room reeked of cheap disinfectant and stale cigarettes. Lucas Mahoney sat at the edge of the bed, eyes hollow, his hands trembling as Jonathan entered. He looked thinner than the video footage showed. Older, too. There was a half-finished bottle of cheap whiskey on the table and a crumpled Airbridge crew badge tossed beside it. "You came," Lucas muttered, avoiding eye contact. Jonathan said nothing, just sat across from him, back straight, eyes steady. "You want to know the truth?" Lucas asked. "The real truth?" "It wasn't just me." Jonathan leaned in. "Then say it." Lucas sighed, rubbing his temples like he was trying to massage guilt from his skull. "They told us not to serve certain passengers the same way. Never officially, but you knew. If someone made a fuss, or if they looked like they didn't belong, slow service, ignore complaints, keep things moving. Who told you, Jonathan asked. Lucas swallowed hard. Our lead. Crew Chief Sanderson. He said, don't be too nice to the ones who look like trouble. He never said race, but everyone knew what he meant. And the bottle Lucas's face twisted. I was dared. We were laughing about how important you looked. Sanderson smirked and said, bet he won't even notice. The bottle was supposed to go to disposal. I swapped it as a joke. I didn't think Jonathan's hand curled slowly into a fist, but he didn't move. You didn't think it would matter because you thought I wouldn't matter. Lucas nodded slowly, shame thick in the air. I never thought it would blow up like this. I just did what everyone did, what we all got away with. There it was, the quiet part, spoken out loud. Jonathan didn't need a signed affidavit. The recording alone was gold. By the time he walked out of room 206, the file was already backed up to 3 servers and routed to Marcus and his litigation team. This changes everything, Marcus said, pacing in the conference room that afternoon. We go to the press tonight. But Jonathan shook his head. Not yet. Let the airline squirm. We leak parts strategically. They launched the Unfiltered Air campaign, a controlled drip of whistleblower audio crew training, excerpts, and anonymized employee testimonies. Each post hit harder than the last. One featured a former gate agent confessing they were told to scrutinize IDs more closely if the passenger looked suspicious or ethnic. Another clip captured a laughing manager referring to the first-class cabin as the good genes section. The response was immediate. Hashtags exploded. Unfiltered air bridge, bias justice for Jonathan sponsors began to pull ads. Shareholders called emergency meetings. 2 members of the airline's Diversity and Inclusion Board resigned Live on Air. And Airbridge's CEO, he panicked. In a hastily arranged press conference, CEO Richard Hammond attempted to recenter the narrative. These allegations do not reflect our values, he said, voice tight, sweat gleaming under studio lights. We are launching a thorough investigation, Jonathan interrupted the broadcast with a tweet containing one of Lucas's voice recordings. It hit 3 million views in 90 minutes. Behind the scenes, the legal chess match intensified. The airline's attorneys scrambled to contain the fallout. They offered Jonathan a massive settlement, 8-figure sealed records, and a public apology tailored to his script. Jonathan didn't even read it. Tell them I'll see them in court, he said flatly, and on every screen in America. With the trial date nearing, Marcus recommended a bold move. We deposed the CEO. Under oath, live streamed. Jonathan didn't flinch. Make it happen. And they did. Under oath, Richard Hammond fumbled badly. He denied knowledge of the bottle prank until Marcus revealed internal texts showing he was informed within 30 minutes of landing and chose not to act. He denied systemic bias until shown budget documents that cut bias training to under 5 minutes per crew member. Just enough to say, you did it. Marcus said, his voice cold. Hammond blinked, his mouth a tight line of retreat. And across the world, millions watched. Back in his office, Jonathan stood in the dark, the city a blaze of light beneath his window. He held the cleaner bottle in one hand, now empty and sealed in a display case. Not a trophy, a reminder. They had underestimated him. That was their first mistake. But trying to cover it up, that would be their last. The courtroom pulsed with a silent intensity that no air conditioning could cool. It wasn't just another day of proceedings. This was the day Jonathan Pryce took the stand. The gallery was packed. Civil rights attorneys, journalists, former passengers, even airline employees in plain clothes. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the pressure was tangible. Every seat filled, every eye watching. Jonathan walked slowly to the witness box. His charcoal suit was immaculate, not flashy but deliberate. He took the oath with calm clarity, then sat folding his hands, eyes locked forward. The opposing counsel, a sharp-jawed man named Harris, with a Harvard degree and no conscience, rose. Mr. Pryce, you claim to have been intentionally humiliated by airline staff. Are you suggesting this was a premeditated act? I'm stating it, Jonathan replied coolly. And I brought receipts. The judge gave a neutral nod, gesturing for Marcus Diaz to begin playback. The first recording, Mahoney's voice gravelly and raw. It wasn't just me. We all knew who to ignore. The courtroom froze. Gasps were audible from the gallery. Jurors leaned forward. Harris tried to object, but the judge overruled it. The audio was admissible, and it was just the beginning. Next came testimony from internal documents, complaints, buried memos marked, "Do not escalate," emails with racial sensitivity, fatigue, and subject lines. Each piece built on the last, like bricks, stacking into a wall of guilt. Harris adjusted his tie and stood. "Mr. Price, let me ask, do you think one act of cruelty justifies this circus?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "One act doesn't start a movement, but covering it up does." The room stirred again. "You're using this moment for attention," Harris said sharply. "Isn't it true your company has seen increased investment since you launched this campaign?" Jonathan's voice was even. "People don't invest in outrage. They invest in leadership. Maybe you should try it." The jury reacted subtly. Eyebrows raised, one nodding faintly. Harris's shoulders tightened. "Let's talk about the glass," he said next. "You made 3 executives drink a foul-tasting liquid on live TV. That was a publicity stunt, not justice." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "Justice doesn't have to be silent. It has to be seen." Across the room, the airline's general counsel sat, stiff hands clasped in his lap. Behind him, the CEO who replaced Hammond, Richard Evans, looked distinctly less confident than during his appointment press tour. The tide had turned. That afternoon, Marcus Diaz called an unexpected witness, a woman named Regina Lowe, former Airbridge VP of Human Resources. Regina walked slowly, her cane tapping rhythmically. 62, sharp-witted and unshakable. She had worked for Airbridge for 23 years until she didn't. "Ms. Lowe," Marcus began, "can you explain why you left?" "I was fired," she said bluntly, "after filing a report about racial bias in crew evaluations." The courtroom hushed. "And what was in your report?" "That black and brown crew members were rated lower by supervisors even when their performance was identical to others. That black passengers received more complaints and more service delays. That none of the complaints were ever addressed. Were you told why your report was dismissed?" She nodded. "We can't afford that narrative." "That's what they told me." "Who is they?" She turned slowly and pointed to the airline's legal team and executive box. "Them." The silence was seismic. By the end of the week, Airbridge's PR team had launched counter-campaigns, glowing employee profiles, a last-minute diversity initiative, charitable donations to racial justice groups. But it was too late. The public saw through it, because in court, they saw something raw, something real. Not the optics, the harm. At Jonathan's next press conference, a reporter asked, "Do you believe the airline should be shut down?" He didn't pause. "No. But the version that existed, that should be gone already." He leaned in, voice quieter but deadlier. "And if it's not, I'll finish the job." The board of Airbridge held a crisis meeting 3 days later in a sealed suite in Midtown. They sat in tailored suits, sipping bitter coffee, surrounded by screens showing polling data, stock fluctuations, and legal briefings. Panic was setting in. One executive said, "If we keep fighting, we go under." Another added, "But if we settle, we admit systemic failure." The chairman finally stood. "We've already admitted it every time we said nothing." By dawn, internal communications confirmed what Jonathan had hoped for. The board had authorized a full-scale settlement discussion with him. But Jonathan didn't want a check. He wanted something far more dangerous. At the negotiation table, surrounded by attorneys, he slid a single-page document across the polished wood. "This is my offer." The room scanned it. It wasn't a dollar amount. It was a list: 1. Independent oversight committee for all future bias complaints. 2. Mandatory retraining and certification of every flight attendant and supervisor. A public apology, not a press release but a televised acknowledgement. Permanent whistleblower protections for all employees. A seat on the airline's corporate ethics board for Jonathan himself, the head of legal, scoffed. "That's overreach." Jonathan stared. "That's reform. Or we continue and I take you apart in discovery." No one spoke for a moment. Then quietly, the general counsel nodded. "We'll take it to the board." Outside, Marcus smiled for the first time in weeks. "That wasn't just a power play," he said, eyes gleaming. "That was a system realignment." Jonathan didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky. "You want to stop them from poisoning people," he murmured. "You make them drink their own rules." He walked down the courthouse steps as protesters cheered and camera shutters flickered like applause. Not just heard, not just seen. He was the storm they never saw coming. The Airbridge boardroom, once a place of polished confidence and rehearsed dominance, was now a bunker under siege. On the 12th floor of their Manhattan headquarters, executives sat around a custom-carved walnut table, watching the live broadcast of Jonathan Price's terms being dissected on national television. CNN, MSNBC, even conservative-leaning outlets couldn't look away. "This isn't just a PR crisis anymore," muttered CFO Melanie Harkins. "It's operational. Pilots are threatening to strike in solidarity. We're losing control of the culture." Across the table, interim CEO Richard Evans's hands were trembling. Not visibly, but enough for those who knew him to catch it. 1 week earlier, the board had reluctantly agreed to Jonathan Price's list of non-negotiables. It wasn't about money. This man had turned down 3 separate 8-figure settlements. It was about systems and dismantling them. The first collapse came quietly, at exactly 9:00 a.m. The New York State Attorney General's office issued subpoenas to Airbridge's compliance division. An investigation was launched into the destruction of internal complaints. Within hours, whistleblowers inside the company, emboldened by Jonathan's testimony and the growing national movement, flooded legal hotlines with first-hand accounts. Racially coded memos, unreported altercations, mocking emails, unqualified promotions. And then one that stunned even Jonathan, a secretly recorded training video from 2 years earlier where a senior crew trainer laughed as he said, "Rule 1 if they get loud and black call security first, ask questions later." The file leaked. The internet erupted. Airbridge's app ratings tanked to 1 star in under 24 hours. At Viridian Capital, Jonathan's tech firm, the mood was electric but tense. Employees worked in hushed clusters, watching monitors light up with news updates. Jonathan had called an all-staff meeting that morning, no announcements, just presence. He stood before the 100-person team, hands clasped loosely in front of him. "I didn't start this fight to tear down an airline," he said calmly. "I started it because a culture existed where humiliating a black man at 30,000 feet was considered a prank. We don't get to ignore that anymore." There was silence, then slow, purposeful applause. Behind him, Marcus Diaz leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes scanning everyone in the room. He knew what was coming next, even if most didn't, because they were only halfway through the collapse. Airbridge's investors began to flee. First, a West Coast venture fund publicly pulled out of a major aircraft deal. Then a European bank halted all future financing. Within 72 hours, the airline's credit rating was downgraded. The market responded like blood in the water. Short sellers swarmed, and then came the audit leaks. Anonymous files shared with Bloomberg revealed that for the last 5 years, Airbridge had systematically overcharged minority passengers on last-minute bookings. The algorithm they used was supposedly neutral, but internal notes referenced terms like risk profile and cabin visibility. In short, it wasn't neutral at all. Jonathan's team dropped a 78-page investigative report with visual receipts and data charts. They didn't editorialize it. They let the facts convict. In Washington, senators on the Transportation Oversight Committee requested an emergency hearing. By then, Jonathan had already submitted formal testimony, but he didn't wait for an invitation to walk the halls of power. With Marcus and Ellis at his side, he met with key aides, FAA regulators, and Department of Transportation officials. His tone wasn't combative, it was surgical. "I don't need legislation to go viral," he told one staffer. "But you need it if you want to avoid being on the wrong side of history." Behind closed doors, deals were drafted, and they weren't small. Jonathan proposed a permanent civil rights division within the FAA, one with teeth. They monitor planes for turbulence. But who's monitoring dignity? The staffer had no answer. Back in court, the discovery process cracked wide open. Emails from the former CEO revealed a chain of command not only aware of the bathroom cleaner incident, but actively working to suppress it. Do not escalate. Settle quietly if needed. Our core flyers don't care about performative outrage. The signature at the bottom, Hammond himself. Judge Langston, already unimpressed, scheduled an evidentiary hearing to consider corporate negligence charges. That meant personal liability prison, not just payouts. By the time that news hit Wall Street, Airbridge's shares had fallen 38%. Their insurance carriers filed notice of reassessment. Employees leaked internal Slack conversations showing execs strategizing on how to spin the diversity crisis as a strength. But the public wasn't buying it anymore, because what started with one contaminated bottle had turned into a clean break from complacency. On Twitter, a new hashtag rose price of dignity. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a question. How much should someone have to pay in career and safety and spirit just to be treated like a human? Jonathan's face was now on magazine covers. Not grinning, not triumphant, just resolute. A symbol of the one man whose dignity wasn't for sale. And with every lawsuit joined every employee who stepped forward, the scaffolding of Airbridge's untouchable status crumbled. But it wasn't destruction for spectacle. It was demolition for reconstruction. And Jonathan Price had the blueprints. The lobby of Viridian Capital felt different that morning. Not because of new furniture or decor, everything was as it always had been. Minimalist glass walls, quiet potted ferns, the soft hum of an espresso machine in the executive kitchen. But there was something in the air, a kind of stillness, not hesitation, but reverence. Jonathan Price walked through the revolving doors flanked by no entourage, no cameras, and no applause. Just silence. And then slowly, one by one, the employees lining the mezzanine balconies above stood. Not out of protocol, out of respect. They'd seen what he had done not just in the courtroom, not just on camera, but in boardrooms and back channels. He had faced down a billion-dollar institution and won. But this morning, as he moved through the building, it wasn't victory he carried. It was transformation. In a quiet corner of the legal suite, Marcus Diaz reviewed the final consent decree. The binding document spelled the beginning of Airbridge's New Reality Federal Monitor's annual audits, restitution to affected passengers, and a permanent equity oversight committee. But more than any clause or fine, the real turning point had come from within. The airline's new interim ethics officer was none other than David Collins, the executive who had turned whistleblower. His first act, a sweeping internal truth and reconciliation process modeled after what Jonathan's team had proposed months earlier. Anonymous confession portals, open forum testimonies, protected speech clauses. It wasn't perfect, but it was happening. At noon, Jonathan met with Tyler and his mother in a sunlit garden cafe uptown. Tyler, now fully aware of everything that had unfolded, sat proudly in his blazer, a red enamel pin shaped like a scale of justice on his lapel. I showed the video to my civics class, he said, taking a long sip of orange soda. Even the kids who never say anything, they clapped. His mother's hand gently touched Jonathan's wrist. He wrote his essay about you, said you taught him what power really is. Jonathan smiled, quietly humbled. It wasn't me, he said, it was all of us. They sat in silence for a while. The chaos had passed, but the noise hadn't faded completely. Calls still came in, reporters still sent requests. Donations to the Tyler Foundation were pouring in faster than the infrastructure could scale. But in this moment, there was peace. That evening, back at Viridian's main auditorium, something extraordinary unfolded. Jonathan stood before a crowd of young professionals, all participants in a new leadership accelerator program he'd launched, one designed specifically for underrepresented talent in corporate America. They weren't Ivy League prodigies or legacy interns. They were first-generation college grads, formerly incarcerated men and women, immigrants, survivors. And they had questions. How do you stay calm when they try to humiliate you publicly? One young man asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the far wall where a massive screen played muted footage from the moment he drank the fake water. The moment that changed everything. I wasn't calm, he said eventually. I was precise. Precision looks like calm to people who don't know the storm inside you. There was a hush, a few nods, and then the next question. What now? The answer was unfolding already. Other airlines were rewriting their passenger handling protocols. Airport vendors, fearing legal exposure, had begun phasing out unvetted chemical suppliers. The FAA's new civil rights unit, nicknamed the Price Division by the press, had its first black female director. Jonathan didn't smile at the news. He just nodded, as if all of this had always been part of the blueprint. On the anniversary of the incident, a letter arrived at Jonathan's office. No return address, no signature. Just one sentence on heavy cream stationery. I used to laugh at passengers like you. I don't anymore. Thank you for making me see. It was unsigned. Jonathan folded it slowly and placed it in the drawer of his desk. It didn't matter who sent it. What mattered was that someone changed, somewhere. Later that night, Jonathan sat alone in his study, the fireplace casting warm flickers on the dark wood-paneled walls. He picked up a leather-bound journal and began writing not for public release, not for press or publication, just for himself. He wrote about rage, he wrote about restraint, he wrote about how the cost of dignity was not silence but risk, and how he paid it forward in full. He closed the book, stood up, and walked to the window. Below, the city moved as it always did, buses, taxis, late-night lights, and tired feet heading home. But above, in that quiet room, something new had taken shape. Not revenge, not vindication, rebirth. Not of Jonathan alone, but of a culture that had long accepted humiliation as normal, and now had to reckon with those who refused to bow. 3 weeks after the televised humiliation of Airbridge executives, the ripple effects finally reached the institutions that had long turned a blind eye. Inside the sprawling gray marble building of the Department of Transportation's Civil Aviation Bureau, an emergency session convened unlike any in recent memory. The top-floor conference room, usually home to cautious regulation updates and sterile legal reviews, now buzzed with urgency. On the wall screen was the footage that had upended the industry. Jonathan Price standing firm on a stage holding a glass of symbolic cruelty in his hand, while 3 visibly shaken executives grimaced through sips of their own manufactured shame. The new acting Secretary of Transportation, Brenda Harris, didn't bother with small talk. She pointed at the paused video. This moment has forced our hand," she said, looking around the table. "We have 2 options: reform the aviation sector now, or let the public burn it down for us." Murmurs of agreement rumbled. Someone added, "The Price Doctrine is trending as proposed legislation on Twitter." Harris nodded. "Then let's draft the damn doctrine before Congress does it for us." Across the country, state attorneys general followed suit. In Illinois, the Attorney General's office issued subpoenas to 8 regional airlines with past passenger discrimination claims. In Georgia, a task force formed to investigate the use of unregulated cleaning agents aboard commercial flights. And in California, Senator Jorge Ramirez introduced a bill mandating third-party bias audits for every airline operating in U.S. airspace. Jonathan's legal team tracked every development on a whiteboard that had outgrown the conference room. What started as a single case had metastasized into a full-scale movement, leaving boardrooms scrambling to adapt. Back inside Airbridge headquarters, the fallout took a more desperate tone. The company's chief operating officer resigned under pressure. 3 regional directors were suspended after whistleblower testimony confirmed their roles in burying complaints from Black passengers. And in the Human Resources Division, a long-overlooked report surfaced buried 5 years ago, warning of deeply ingrained bias among certain crew members. That report was signed by a junior HR analyst. She had been laid off 2 months later. At a press conference that drew national media, Airbridge's board chair announced the creation of a Dignity Council designed to monitor airline practices and report to shareholders quarterly. But when asked by a reporter if Jonathan Price had been consulted in its creation, the chair stammered, "No, but we're certainly open to dialogue." Jonathan, watching from his office, simply shook his head. He didn't need a seat at their new table. He was building his own. At Viridian Tech, structural consequences manifested differently. Investor interest surged. Clients who had once been hesitant now praised Jonathan's courage. His board, once split on his crusade, now rallied behind him, recognizing not just the moral strength of his stance, but the long-term vision it represented. "Investors don't just want profits anymore," his CFO said. "They want principles," and the company delivered. Viridian launched a joint initiative with historically Black colleges and universities to increase representation in STEM aviation fields. They announced a fellowship for whistleblowers in corporate America. And quietly behind the scenes, Jonathan commissioned a team of technologists to begin work on something radical, a real-time discrimination reporting app for airline passengers. It would use geolocation, encrypted data submission, and anonymous sharing capabilities. He named it Clear Skies. But as his influence grew, so did the pressure. One morning, he opened an envelope with no return address. Inside was a printout of a death threat scrawled in red ink, the words underlined multiple times. "Stay out of the skies or we'll bring you down." He didn't flinch. He called his security chief and doubled Tyler's protection detail. Then he went on national television that evening to speak about the threat and why it only proved the movement's necessity. "When power feels threatened, it panics," Jonathan said to millions watching. "But we don't retreat in fear. We step forward with clarity." In a downtown cafe in Minneapolis, 2 flight attendants, both recently suspended, after a separate racial profiling incident, spoke in hushed tones. One leaned across the table, her eyes tired. "They're auditing our hiring history. It's not just Airbridge anymore." The other nodded grimly. "My union rep said things are shifting for good." Indeed they were. The National Flight Crew Association, under growing public scrutiny, issued a formal apology to Black and minority passengers for decades of cultural negligence in the industry. They also pledged to implement Jonathan's proposed training modules, which were already being piloted in 3 major hubs. But perhaps the clearest structural impact appeared at the annual Global Air Consortium in Geneva. Jonathan was invited as a keynote speaker. He walked onto the stage, greeted not with applause, but with silence, respect, and unspoken accountability from a room full of airline CEOs. He didn't lecture. He simply said, "Fix your policies or fix your exit strategies, because the next generation won't fly with you unless they trust you." That night, several CEOs privately approached him, seeking guidance not in damage control, but in transformation. The system was shifting, not fast enough, not everywhere, but the ground beneath their polished shoes was moving, and they all knew why. Jonathan Price had turned public humiliation into institutional reckoning, and the world would never fly the same way again. The first reversal of power didn't come from a courtroom or a senator or even from Jonathan Price himself. It came from an unexpected voice, one that had been ignored until now. Her name was Layla Rowe. She was a 48-year-old former Airbridge flight attendant who had resigned quietly 2 years earlier after reporting racially charged behavior by a senior colleague. Her concerns were buried, her file labeled unsubstantiated, and her career derailed. Now, with the world watching, she stepped out of the shadows. At a town hall forum broadcast live on national news, Layla approached the microphone with a shaky voice and a folded letter in her hands. "I was told to stop being dramatic," she said. "I was told that Black passengers were naturally disruptive. That's what I heard in training. That's what I heard behind the curtain." She paused, lifting the letter so the cameras could see the Airbridge insignia at the top. "This is my termination notice, dated March the 3rd, 2023. I was fired not for lying, but for telling the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The moderator tried to move on, but it was too late. The tides were already turning. Within hours, Layla's testimony went viral. Believe the crew trended across platforms. Hundreds of current and former employees, flight attendants, gate agents, custodians shared their own stories. They didn't just describe racism, they described retaliation for trying to stop it. Jonathan watched the posts roll in with a mix of solemnity and hope. This was the shift he'd been waiting for, not just top-down reform, but bottom-up revolt. By the end of the week, 3 more whistleblowers had stepped forward with documents, screenshots, even audio recordings of supervisors dismissing passengers' complaints with lines like, "He's just sensitive," or "It's always about race with them." One recording featured a supervisor laughing, "We've been giving the cheap drinks to the row 3s for years. Ain't nobody gonna check the barcode." Jonathan's legal team immediately moved to expand the scope of their class action to include employee retaliation and internal sabotage. What started as a personal case now stood on the edge of becoming the largest racial discrimination suit in airline history. But in the boardroom of Airbridge, panic was turning into collapse. Internal emails revealed that 2 board members had quietly resigned under mounting pressure. Investor confidence plummeted another 13% in 2 days. The brand's decades-old sponsorship deal with the National Sports Federation was suspended indefinitely. And then came the subpoena. Signed by a federal judge, it demanded full access to Airbridge's internal misconduct reports going back 10 years across all departments. This wasn't just reputational damage. This was structural collapse. And while Airbridge scrambled to control the bleeding, Jonathan launched his next bold initiative. It was a platform called Passenger Power, a public database where airline passengers could report discriminatory experiences, rate flight crews anonymously, and access legal resources in real time. Within a week, the site had over 400,000 unique visits and 2,000 reports filed across 12 major airlines. Executives across the aviation sector took notice. In a hastily organized emergency session of the International Aviation Council, senior representatives from multiple airlines huddled around a glowing projection screen showing real-time spikes in complaint reports. A Lufthansa representative leaned back, pale and sweating. If this gets to Brussels, it's not just bad press, it's legislation. The Emirates delegate added, it's only a matter of time before insurance providers start pulling coverage. And then a voice from the corner, quiet but cutting Jonathan Price, just changed how the skies are governed. No one laughed. They all knew it was true. Meanwhile, inside Viridian Tech's innovation wing, Jonathan reviewed blueprints for a new AI-powered bias detection system designed for in-flight use. The goal scanned for behavioral patterns in crew interactions, voice tone, response, delays, passenger feedback, and alert supervisors to potential bias incidents in real time. It was controversial, it was bold, and it was already attracting interest from global airlines who didn't want to be the next Airbridge. Jonathan turned to his CTO and said, "We don't build tech to monitor people. We build it to protect people." As all eyes turned to him, something else began to shift. For the first time in the industry's history, Black executives and flight staff across competing airlines began quietly coordinating behind the scenes. WhatsApp groups, Zoom calls, encrypted meetings. They started sharing notes, compiling data, strategizing. Jonathan joined one of the calls late one night. "What do we call this?" someone asked. Jonathan paused, then smiled. "We call it altitude equity." They all nodded. Then came the moment no one saw coming. At a National Aviation Awards ceremony that Airbridge had once dominated, the chairman of the award committee stepped on stage and made a quiet but powerful announcement. For the first time, this year's Equity in Aviation Award does not go to a company, he said. It goes to a man who reminded the world what leadership looks like under pressure. "Jonathan Price, please come forward." Jonathan stood slowly from the back row, stunned. As applause filled the hall, he walked to the stage, accepting the crystal trophy with steady hands. But when he reached the mic, he didn't gloat. He didn't even speak about himself. "I'm accepting this for every crew member who was told to stay quiet, for every child who watched their parent be humiliated and thought it was normal. This isn't my award. This is the world saying we're done flying blind." The crowd stood as one. Power had reversed. But Jonathan knew the real turbulence was still ahead. 2 months after the courtroom verdict and the viral humiliation of Airbridge's executives, the landscape of the airline was unrecognizable. A new CEO had been appointed, Elijah Vance, a Black veteran of the aviation industry with a background in logistics and a reputation for unflinching integrity. Elijah wasn't hired for optics. He was hired for survival. Airbridge needed not only a new face, but a new spine. And Elijah made it clear from day one, "I'm not here to save this company's image. I'm here to change its soul." Jonathan Price sat across from Elijah in a private meeting room at the Renaissance Hotel overlooking the Capitol. The walls were bare save for one mounted photo of the Wright brothers. Between them sat a folder, Airbridge's new blueprint for restructuring. "I don't need your endorsement," Elijah said plainly, "but I need your insight. If I'm going to rebuild this house, I need to know where the rot is deepest." Jonathan nodded slowly, watching the man's posture, his voice, his eyes. There was no performative sincerity, no political gloss. "You'll need more than insight," Jonathan replied. "You'll need to burn the floorboards." A silence passed between them, the kind that acknowledges both danger and shared resolve. Then Elijah opened the folder. The first order of business was leadership audits, not just HR, not just middle managers, all leadership up to the board. One by one, executives were summoned to explain decisions, justify emails, account for complaints they dismissed or never investigated. Some resigned before the meetings even happened. Others cried. One notoriously smug attempted to shift blame onto junior staff. Elijah fired him before he left the room. News broke fast, Airbridge CEO cleans house. The media wasn't sure whether to praise Elijah or brace for the airline's collapse. Investors watched cautiously, but passengers, especially Black passengers, began booking tickets again. Back at Viridian Tech, Jonathan continued his mission, but something felt different now. His war had reached a milestone. He'd forced accountability, exposed systemic cruelty, even shaken corporate America's belief that racism was too intangible to prosecute. But leadership wasn't about removing villains, it was about building successors. And that's when he started looking for someone new, not to replace him, but to extend him. A young woman named Zaria Blake caught his eye. She was 29, fierce, eloquent, and the current COO of a small aviation logistics startup Jonathan had been quietly funding. She wasn't a headline yet, but she would be. He invited Zaria to a roundtable discussion at a civil rights summit in Atlanta. She sat between executives twice her age and outmaneuvered them with data moral clarity and calm conviction. When one airline VP smugly suggested that bias training was a legal checkbox, not a culture shift, Zaria didn't flinch. If you view equity as a compliance issue, she said, then you've already admitted you have no culture worth preserving. The room went quiet, then erupted in applause. Jonathan leaned over and whispered, you just made the list. Across town, Elijah Vance faced fire from a different direction. Union reps, stockholders, PR strategists. They didn't want more change. They wanted less drama. This public crusade is killing morale, one VP snapped during a stakeholder call. Elijah calmly unmuted his mic. No, what's killing morale is decades of silence and suppression. What's killing morale is watching Black passengers humiliated on video while our press releases say misunderstanding. You want peace? We earn it. Click, he ended the call. Later that week, he promoted a group of mid-level managers who had been ignored for years despite perfect records. Black, Asian, Latino, and white, all allies, all overlooked. He didn't publicize it. But word spread anyway. Airbridge was no longer just reacting. It was rebuilding. Meanwhile, the Tyler Foundation, Jonathan's nonprofit, hosted its first leadership lab for airline executives. Elijah Vance attended in person. So did representatives from 3 other airlines. Zaria gave the opening keynote. She didn't speak about Jonathan. She spoke about Tyler, about what it felt like to be 12 years old watching someone you love be treated like a criminal for being calm and Black, about what it meant when no one intervened, about what it would take to build a generation that wouldn't need viral videos to be believed. Her words broke the room open. Halfway through, one white exec from a major airline wiped tears from his eyes. By the end, he stood and said quietly, we've been reactive. I want us to be righteous. Jonathan watched from the side of the stage, hands clasped. He didn't need to speak. Zaria had already said everything that mattered. Leadership had shifted. It wasn't about him anymore, it was about the future. In the months that followed, Airbridge implemented a real-time feedback platform in all flights. Passengers could rate interactions, report microaggressions, or commend crew in real time. The system wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The airline also released its first equity audit report publicly, a raw, unvarnished look at years of failure. Some called it PR suicide. Others called it the new standard. Jonathan just called it overdue. One afternoon, as the sun set behind Veridian's tower, Jonathan stood at the window watching the city buzz below. Zaria entered quietly holding a thick binder. What's that, he asked. Our proposal for the industry-wide ethics board, she replied. A coalition of CEOs, civil rights leaders, regulators, and whistleblowers. Oversight, transparency, teeth. Jonathan looked at her and smiled. You ready to lead this? Zaria nodded firm, not just ready, made for it. Jonathan turned away from the window. Then it's yours. Power had reversed. Now it was time to build something worth keeping. The first meeting of the newly formed industry-wide ethics board took place inside a marble-lined conference room at the Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. Every chair at the round table held weight. Executives from major airlines, federal regulators, civil rights, attorneys, union leaders, and most notably, Zaria Blake, seated at the head, clipboard in hand, her expression composed but razor-sharp. What had started as a personal humiliation on a flight had now birthed a national reckoning. We are not here to discuss diversity as a slogan, Zaria began, her voice clear and controlled. We are here to rewrite the way power behaves at 30,000 feet. A few in the room shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward. Her presence didn't demand attention, it earned it. Across from her sat Thomas Harlan, Senior VP of the Aviation Alliance. For years, he'd blocked anti-discrimination proposals behind closed doors, citing cost and passenger comfort. He spoke first. No one disagrees with the principle of fair treatment, he said. But surveillance audits and public reporting, these will disrupt operations. Zaria didn't blink. Disruption is the point, Mr. Harlan. Comfort has never been the standard for those of us targeted by institutional negligence. The system you protect is already disruptive, just not to people who look like you. Gasped murmurs. Someone at the far end muttered, she's not wrong. In the weeks that followed, the board drafted a slate of reforms so sweeping that airline lobbyists panicked. Among the key proposals, mandatory de-escalation training for all flight staff every 6 months with certified instructors from civil rights organizations. Body cams for in-flight security personnel activated anytime a passenger is removed or restrained. An independent ombuds office where passengers can report discrimination outside of airline-controlled systems. Quarterly public audits revealing patterns of complaint and resolution by race, gender, and flight route. Some called it overreach. Jonathan Price called it long overdue. And now he wasn't the only one with a voice in the room. At Viridian Tech, Jonathan met with Elijah Vance and Zaria to review implementation models. The whiteboard behind them was filled with timelines, budget breakdowns, and pushback scenarios. Resistance is rising again, Elijah said, circling a line that read, Regional Director, Non-Compliance Midwest Hub. Some managers are quietly encouraging soft defiance, skipping trainings, encouraging crews to file passenger aggression reports if they feel watched. Zaria tapped her pen against the table. Old playbook. Manufactured backlash to stall accountability. Jonathan folded his arms. Let's preempt them. Create a certified equity partner badge system. If employees complete all reforms and score high in feedback, they get flagged on manifests. Let passengers know who's actually safe. Elijah raised a brow. Turn trust into a visible currency. Exactly. The badge system launched a month later, and within days, passengers began posting selfies with equity crew members on social media. Flights with higher badge ratings saw surges in bookings. For once, decency became a business advantage. But not everyone was cheering. Inside a shadowy boardroom in Chicago, 3 airline CEOs gathered to discuss a coordinated pushback. We have shareholders screaming about legal exposure, one snapped. Too much reform, too fast. Another leaned forward. We need to control the narrative. Frame this as Jonathan Price's personal vendetta, not an industry crisis. The third man, older, wiry, said nothing for a long time. Then finally, you don't fight a hurricane with an umbrella. If we don't adapt, we drown. Meanwhile, Jonathan returned to the court system, not as a plaintiff, but as an advocate. Working with a legal coalition called Clear Skies, he helped introduce federal legislation called the Passenger Equity and Accountability Act, PEAA. The bill mandated standardized incident reporting across all U.S. airlines and gave the Department of Transportation Enforcement powers over racial bias claims. A senator from California signed on immediately, then a second from Illinois. Then a surprising third, an independent from Montana. The tide was turning, quietly, systemically. At a private fundraiser in New York, a former Airbridge investor pulled Jonathan aside. I'll be honest, the man said, swirling a glass of bourbon. When this all started, I thought you were being dramatic. I thought you were just another angry voice looking for a payday. Jonathan smiled coolly. And now the man hesitated. Now I realize you weren't angry. You were surgical. He raised his glass. You didn't just call out racism. You rewrote how it's documented. Back in Washington, Zaria stood again before the ethics board. We're not done, she said. We fixed parts of the system. But culture can't be legislated. It has to be led. She outlined the next phase in academy that would train airline executives, not just flight crews, in cultural intelligence, ethical leadership, and trauma-informed policy design. No more corporate retreats. No more scripted apologies. This was the beginning of a new breed of leadership. Jonathan's face appeared on the cover of Forbes that fall. The headline read, From Cabin Cruelty to Corporate Reform, How One CEO Triggered an Industry Reckoning. But the photo was misleading, because Jonathan wasn't standing alone. To his left was Elijah, to his right Zaria. Behind them stood hundreds of pilots, flight attendants, lawyers, tech workers, activists, passengers. Real leadership was no longer a solo spotlight. It was a coalition, and the world was finally watching. The morning news hit like thunder. A viral video shot in portrait mode and uploaded by a teenage passenger showed an elderly black woman and coach trying to get help from a flight attendant. She was ignored repeatedly, then accused of being disruptive. The video caught the exact moment another passenger, white, wearing a gold airline medallion, received prompt assistance for the same request. The caption read, 2 requests, 2 passengers, 1 system. Still flying while black. By noon, the hashtag was trending in over 30 cities, and this time the world didn't scroll past. In coffee shops, barber shops, church pews, and comment sections, conversations erupted. News anchors replayed the clip, experts broke down unconscious bias in aviation, and travel influencers began publishing their own testimonies. Jonathan Price watched it all from the quiet of his living room. Tyler curled up on the couch beside him. "You think they're finally getting it?" the boy asked, not taking his eyes off the screen. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He was watching something deeper than just the footage. He was watching the shift. Not in policy, in people. That night on cable news, Zaria Blake appeared opposite a retired airline executive. "This is being blown out of proportion," he insisted. "Airlines are doing their best under pressure." Zaria didn't flinch. Doing their best is no comfort to people consistently dismissed in first class and over-policed in coach. We've heard those lines before. You're not describing progress. You're describing The anchor blinked, then pivoted. Wow. "Blake, what would real progress look like?" Zaria folded her hands calmly. "Real progress means a child doesn't have to memorize how to be non-threatening before boarding a plane." Within a week, several major airlines rushed to release statements of renewed commitment to fairness. But passengers weren't satisfied with words anymore. They wanted receipts. One TikTok creator compiled a timeline of recent aviation bias incidents. Her voice trembled in places she'd lived it too, but her message was sharp as glass. If your policy only works when no one's filming, it's not a policy. It's a performance. The video received over 4 million views in 48 hours. The people were speaking, loudly, clearly, and they weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. At a nationally televised town hall, Jonathan stood before a mixed crowd of activists, executives, and everyday flyers. The moderator opened with a blunt question. "You've changed policy. You've won in court. Why keep pushing?" Jonathan leaned into the mic, his tone calm but firm. "Because I'm not fighting for applause. I'm fighting for the mother who flies twice a year and still gets followed by security. I'm fighting for the father who's asked to prove again that the child beside him is his. I'm fighting because this system doesn't just fail sometimes. It fails systematically." Applause erupted, but Jonathan raised his hand. "We don't need more applause. We need more action." In classrooms, teachers used Jonathan's story to discuss ethics, leadership, and institutional change. School children read illustrated books adapted from his journey. One scene showed a boy offering a water bottle to a man in a suit who had just been mistreated. The boy said, "They tried to poison him, but he turned it into power." Tyler's teacher called one day saying he talks about you during class speeches, says you taught him how to be brave. Jonathan's throat tightened. Not from pride, from responsibility. The ripple widened. A startup airline launched with a mission to build equity into its model from the ground up. Staff recruitment, passenger feedback training, route design. Their tagline, "Everyone belongs," at 30,000 feet. Their founder cited Jonathan as their blueprint. In a radio interview, she said, "We're not trying to be progressive. We're trying to be honest." And being honest means admitting that the sky hasn't been fair. Meanwhile, employees at legacy airlines began organizing quietly. A network of Black, Latino, Asian, and indigenous flight staff began a coalition named the Elevation Crew. Their mission to protect each other from retaliation, to report injustice, and to build solidarity across airlines, unions, and passenger groups. One crew member posted anonymously, "We watched what Jonathan did, and we realized we're not helpless. We're just unorganized." Months later, at a conference for aviation leaders, a senior director took the stage and opened with an unexpected statement. "Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that many of us built careers on a system we now know was flawed. It's not enough to apologize. It's time to rebuild from the inside out." A standing ovation followed. In the back row, Jonathan and Zaria exchanged a quiet glance. Not because the moment was perfect, but because it was different. That evening, back home, Jonathan took a rare walk alone. No phone, no team, just the sound of his own footsteps. He passed a mural painted on a brick wall, his face beside a plane with words in graffiti script, "Not just turbulence, a revolution." He smiled, not because the fight was over, but because it had finally become everyone's. At the World Aviation Leadership Forum in Geneva, change didn't just arrive, It walked in wearing tailored gray and purpose. Jonathan Price stood in the center of the grand conference room, surrounded by hundreds of executives from global airlines, aviation regulators, union leaders, and transportation ministers. Many had come reluctantly out of political pressure or media scrutiny. Others had come curious. But all eyes were on the man whose name had become synonymous with corporate accountability. He wasn't introduced as Mr. Price, CEO of Aerovista Tech. The MC said plainly, "Please welcome Jonathan Price, the reason this room isn't silent anymore." The forum's theme was listed as Future Skies, Equity, Security, and Innovation. But the air in the room wasn't about the future, it was about reckoning. Jonathan opened with calm precision. "I've been told this industry is too big to change. That culture is slow to shift. But I was nearly poisoned at 30,000 feet. I didn't ask for change, I demanded it, because the sky belongs to all of us." The applause started cautiously, then it swelled. Behind the scenes, ripple effects were already forming. Delta Ridge Airlines, a legacy carrier with decades of history and more than a few buried complaints, announced a surprise merger with a rising equity-based airline backed by global investors. But the catch, the new terms required compliance with the Price Equity Protocol, a sweeping anti-discrimination framework Jonathan's foundation had drafted alongside civil rights attorneys and transportation experts. When questioned by reporters, a Delta Ridge executive muttered, "Look, we can't afford to be seen as the next cautionary tale." That wasn't regret speaking, that was fear. Elsewhere, airline unions began rewriting their training policies under pressure from their own members. Internal emails leaked by whistleblowers revealed flight attendants demanding accountability from their supervisors. "We've been forced to carry a culture of bias we didn't create." One steward wrote, union leaders launched a reform council. They invited Jonathan to consult. He didn't gloat. He brought data, survivor testimonies, and strategies. And when they asked what real reform looked like, he handed them a document labeled Dignity Protocol: From Uniform to Humanity. The FAA, long accused of reacting instead of leading, hosted its first public roundtable on racial profiling in aviation history. Jonathan was the keynote. "I don't believe in punishing individuals without addressing institutions. We don't need better apologies. We need better systems." Behind him, a screen displayed the faces of passengers, wronged, some famous, some forgotten. One child's story stood out. She had been separated from her grandmother mid-flight for being unaccompanied, even though they sat together in the same row. It wasn't a mistake, it was design. Jonathan turned back to the crowd. "You can't fix what you refuse to name." A week later, European airlines, long considered progressive, came under fire when investigative journalists inspired by Jonathan's movement uncovered their own ugly truths. In Frankfurt, a prominent carrier faced lawsuits for segregated seating suggestions based on racial demographics and tourist class. In Paris, a crew union admitted they'd been using internal codes to discreetly flag passengers of color for extra security checks. These weren't coincidences, they were consequences. One French journalist tweeted, "The price effect is global, and it's just begun." Back in the US, several CEOs who had once dismissed Jonathan's campaign as performative activism now sought quiet meetings with his team. They wanted guidance. They offered donations. They tried to soften reputations scarred by silence. Zaria Blake took the lead in many of those meetings. Her presence was sharp but composed. One CEO, hoping for leniency, asked if the foundation would consider a partnership instead of a policy audit. Zaria raised one eyebrow. "We don't partner with what we plan to dismantle." At Viridian Ventures, a major investor firm with holdings across global transportation, Jonathan addressed a select group of decision-makers. Instead of appealing to morality, he appealed to metrics. "Discrimination is inefficient," he said. "It leads to lawsuits, staff attrition, bad press, and shrinking loyalty." Then he presented charts showing how airlines adopting the equity protocol saw a 17% increase in passenger satisfaction and 9% rise in staff retention within months. A room full of numbers, men and women began scribbling furiously. He ended with, "You don't have to believe in justice to believe in math. But if you care about both, you'll be first to win." Even beyond aviation, other industries began watching closely. A rideshare company quietly reached out wanting to discuss algorithmic bias. A hotel chain requested a pilot project on front desk training reform. An elite university invited Jonathan to help review their campus travel guidelines after a donor's child had been wrongly profiled during a study abroad flight. He said yes, but on one condition. We don't do band-aids, we build operating rooms. One late night, Jonathan stood on his balcony overlooking the city skyline, tired but awake. Zaria joined him, coffee in hand. "Do you think they really mean it?" she asked. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He watched a plane cut through the sky, just a speck of silver in a sea of blue-black night. "They don't have to mean it yet," he finally said. "They just have to fear not meaning it." Zaria nodded slowly. "Fear's a start." Jonathan turned to her, and for the first time in weeks, his expression softened. But belief, that's where the future lives. The world was watching, and now Jonathan Price was ready to show them everything. It began with a countdown. A massive digital clock appeared on the home screen of the Equity Foundation's website. 72 hours, then 48, then 24. Social media buzzed with wild theories. Some speculated another executive takedown. Others expected the launch of a reform bill. The hashtags "The Final Exposure" and "Sky Justice" trended for 3 straight days. At precisely 12 p.m. on a clear Thursday afternoon, the live stream went live. More than 10 million people tuned in during the first 10 minutes. Jonathan stepped onto the stage at the Smithsonian Center for Civil Aviation History, deliberately chosen. Behind him, a massive screen. In front of him, a sea of journalists, activists, lawmakers, and victims' families seated in silent anticipation. He took a breath. Then he spoke. "What we're about to share is not an allegation. It's not a protest. It is proof." The screen lit up. The presentation was titled "Documents of Denial." It began with internal emails leaked directly from the airline's executive servers, obtained by whistleblower David Clark and authenticated by third-party cybersecurity firms. The first slide showed an email dated 2 weeks after Jonathan's incident. "If we allow this to become precedent, we lose control of the narrative. Shut it down." Quietly. The audience gasped. Next came a spreadsheet. Hundreds of passenger complaints marked resolved with identical replies. Then the bombshell. A slide labeled "Code Terms for Flagging Passengers" revealed color-coded tags used to quietly profile Black, Muslim, and Latino flyers under the guise of customer irregularities. One column even labeled certain passengers as WL watch list based on their zip codes alone. The room grew still. Jonathan paused. These weren't the actions of a rogue flight attendant. This was policy, buried beneath layers of plausible deniability. He turned. Click. A video played, a grainy boardroom security recording, executives discussing PR containment strategies. One voice said clearly, "We can afford a few settlements. What we can't afford is a culture shift." A low murmur spread through the crowd. Journalists tapped furiously. A few audience members wiped tears from their cheeks. Jonathan walked slowly to the center of the stage. "You made me drink humiliation. You laughed behind policies and smiled behind press releases. But today you drink the truth." He raised a glass of water, this time actual water, and held it high. "To every passenger who was ever ignored, profiled, or disrespected. This is for you." Then he drank. The crowd rose to their feet. Applause erupted like thunder. Within an hour, the exposure spread globally. Cable news split screens between clips from the live stream and angry passengers sharing their own stories. In Los Angeles, a mother recounted how her 12-year-old was separated during boarding for safety reasons. In Chicago, a pastor revealed he'd been flagged 3 times in 2 months by the same airline without explanation. In Houston, a deaf Black man showed texts from crew members mocking his speech patterns. Each clip shared the same caption: "It wasn't just Jonathan." By nightfall, the airline's stock had dropped 11%. By the next morning, their CEO had resigned. But the real shock came from the Department of Transportation. They issued an emergency order, a full investigation into racial profiling and systemic abuse across all major U.S. carriers. For the first time in aviation history, discrimination was now a matter of national security. The next day, Jonathan met with Congress behind closed doors. The sessions were long and tense. Some senators offered quiet support. Others asked pointed questions. "Are we criminalizing airline mistakes?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "We're criminalizing patterns, Senator. Mistakes are once. This is system." He handed out thick folders. Inside, deposition transcripts, video interviews, whistleblower logs, and a 94-page statistical analysis of bias-based seating arrangements across 6 airlines. He didn't need to say more. By the end of the week, bipartisan legislation began to move through committee. Its name, the Passenger Protection and Equity Act, colloquially the Price Bill. In the days that followed, something strange happened. The attack stopped. No more smear articles, no more anonymous accusations, no sudden PR pushes claiming Jonathan was divisive, because the truth was now undeniable. The final exposure had done its job, not by destroying the airline, but by showing the world how they destroyed themselves. Late one evening, Jonathan received a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. It was short. "I just watched the live stream. I'm sorry for what I did that day. You didn't deserve that." It was the flight attendant. No name, no begging for forgiveness, just a quiet truth spoken too late. Jonathan stared at the phone unmoved. He didn't need apologies. He needed action. Back at the Equity Foundation, the phones rang nonstop. Schools asked to license the live stream for ethics curriculums. Universities wanted to create training programs. Private companies requested audits. Military officials inquired about implicit bias training for transportation teams. Zaria entered his office holding a stack of letters from passengers, staff pilots, even crew from other airlines. Jonathan flipped through them quiet. One note stood out. Scrawled on torn paper, likely from a tray table napkin, "I never thought someone would make them drink their own cruelty." "Thank you," he smiled, just slightly. Then he looked up at Zaria, ready the next plan. She blinked. "You mean there's more?" He nodded. "We exposed the truth, now we build something better." And with that, Jonathan Price, once humiliated mid-flight, became the architect of the skies. The cameras were gone now. The courtrooms had fallen silent. No more flashing lights, no more press conferences, just stillness. But Jonathan Price knew this was the most dangerous part of the journey. It's easy to scream when the world is watching, harder when the world moves on. Inside the quiet halls of the newly formed Civil Aviation Oversight Committee, Jonathan walked slowly, file in hand. The floor beneath him creaked slightly, a reminder that even federal buildings age like systems do silently until something breaks. He wasn't here for applause. He was here to ensure that what he'd exposed didn't fade into bureaucracy. A junior staffer greeted him nervously, clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Price, the commissioner's ready for you," Jonathan nodded, stepped through the door. The room was unassuming. No grand marble columns, just beige walls, old wood paneling, and a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't worked since 2009. But seated at the far end was Commissioner Arlene Torres, a 62-year-old Latina powerhouse with sharp eyes and a sharper memory. "Mr. Price," she said, standing to shake his hand, "you've caused quite the reckoning." Jonathan sat his tone measured, not enough of one. "Yet." She chuckled softly. "I reviewed your final report. Vendor fraud, staff bias, executive collusion. The airline wasn't an outlier. It was a model for everything that's gone wrong in aviation oversight." He placed the folder on the table. "Then let's fix it." They got to work. Quietly. No tweets, no press releases. Just long hours, dry documents, and buried records. Over the next several months, a task force was built, one that would never bear Jonathan's name publicly, but whose design was unmistakably his. Its purpose, to independently investigate racial bias in commercial aviation. Real audits, real authority, real consequences. And while the public thought the storm had passed, the industry knew otherwise. Because behind the silence was Jonathan Price still moving pieces on the board. Meanwhile, at the Equity Foundation headquarters, the pace hadn't slowed. Zaria led a team of new analysts combing through passenger complaints submitted anonymously from around the world. Cases ranged from delayed security screenings to targeted bag checks to arbitrary seat downgrades. Some incidents were subtle, others were blatant. All of them mattered. In one case, a teenage black girl from Atlanta was told to prove her carry-on was hers 3 times on a direct flight to Newark. In another, a Haitian pastor was escorted off a plane after speaking Creole too loudly. Jonathan read each one, not to wallow, but to remember why the fight couldn't stop at policy. That night, he sat alone in his office, surrounded by folders, highlighters, a flickering desk lamp, and a photo of his nephew from years ago, holding a sign that read, "Dignity has no altitude." He whispered almost to himself, "They think silence means surrender." It didn't. It meant planning. 3 weeks later, at a quiet airline union training center in Denver, Jonathan arrived unannounced. He stood in the back of the classroom, arms crossed, listening to an instructor walk a group of new hires through the anti-discrimination onboarding module. Every passenger deserves respect, the trainer said, in a flat monotone, barely glancing at the slides. There's zero tolerance for bias. The room was lifeless. Jonathan waited until the session ended, then approached the trainer. Can I ask how often this material gets updated? The man blinked, unsure who Jonathan was. Every 6 months, I think. We just go through the standard stuff. Jonathan reached into his coat, pulled out a flash drive, and handed it over. Here's your new standard. He didn't wait for a response. That flash drive contained an immersive scenario-based training system developed in partnership with sociologists, behavioral psychologists, and veteran flight crew who joined the movement after seeing their colleagues act with impunity. It included body cam reenactments, AI-generated passenger dialogues, and real case breakdowns, including his own. The goal wasn't to shame, it was to confront. By the following quarter, 12 major airlines adopted it. Not because they were forced to, but because passengers demanded it. In the months that followed, Jonathan declined dozens of interviews. When the Times called, he said no. When 60 Minutes asked for a sit-down, he referred them to whistleblower David Clark. Jonathan didn't need a spotlight anymore. His victory wasn't in going viral. It was in watching the changes quietly take hold, in seeing a young black girl board a plane without being questioned, in hearing from a single mom who said they actually apologized this time, and I believed it. In reading an email from a training instructor who wrote, "Your module made one of our trainees cry." He said, "I never knew we did that to people." That's progress, right? Jonathan didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just filed it away. Evidence that the battle had shifted, not ended. One morning at a local school career day, Jonathan stood beside a science table filled with model airplanes. A boy asked him, "Are you famous?" Jonathan smiled. "No, but I help fix things that shouldn't have been broken." The teacher chuckled. "Mr. Price works in aviation law. He's done a lot." Another student raised her hand. "Are you the guy who made those airline people drink the bad water?" Laughter. Then silence. Jonathan knelt to her eye level. "I made them understand what disrespect tastes like, so they wouldn't serve it to you one day." The girl grinned. "Cool." Jonathan rose slowly. That was enough. That was the win. The world had moved on, but behind the headlines, behind the lawsuits, and behind the boardroom reforms, Jonathan Price had built something far more powerful than a scandal. He had built a shift, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And for the first time in a long time, the skies began to feel just a little more equal. The wind rustled softly through the marble courtyard of the National Civil Rights Museum in Washington, D.C., where a modest but striking plaque had been installed beneath a bronze statue of a man holding a bottle, one hand stretched toward the sky, the other resting protectively over a child. The plaque read, "Jonathan Price." He didn't ask for change, he delivered it. The unveiling ceremony wasn't grand, no orchestras, no parade, just a quiet gathering of people whose lives had been touched directly or indirectly by one man's refusal to accept indignity in silence. Among the crowd were passengers once humiliated, now empowered, crew members who had spoken out, now respected, and students, some barely old enough to fly, who had read about Jonathan's story in history class and believed they too could fight what felt unchangeable. Jonathan stood a few steps back from the podium, watching as a young girl no older than 10 read a letter aloud beside the statue. "My mom says Mr. Price made airplanes safe for people like us," she said. "Before him, I was scared to go places. Now I want to be a pilot." The crowd stirred, not in loud applause but in quiet awe. This was the ripple effect. This was legacy, not carved in bronze but beating in the hearts of those who saw him as more than a CEO, as a mirror of their own possibilities. At Virion Tech's headquarters, the energy was different now, less reactive, more reflective. Jonathan had returned to his post quietly months earlier, not as a symbol of controversy, but as a builder of bridges. The company had expanded its partnerships with universities, launching scholarships for marginalized students, pursuing law, tech, and aviation reform. The boardroom had changed too. No longer just men in navy suits and clipped tones. Now a room with voices from every walk of life. Voices that weren't just heard but heeded. "Legacy isn't just what you leave," Jonathan said once in a strategy meeting. "It's what you build to outlive you," and he built carefully. In a university auditorium in Atlanta, a lecture was underway. The course was titled 21st Century Advocacy from Boardroom to Courtroom. The professor, a young black woman in a tailored gray blazer, clicked to the next slide on the projector. It was a photo of Jonathan at the moment he held the glass to the airline executives. You can debate the ethics of what he did, she told the class, but you can't debate the results. Policies changed, executives stepped down, and for the first time, the FAA rewrote its code of conduct based on a passenger-led case. She paused, letting it settle. That's legacy. One student in the back raised a hand. Is he still active? The professor nodded. Oh, very. But you won't see him on morning shows. You'll see his fingerprints on legislation, his blueprints in training modules, his name in anonymous donation records for victims of travel discrimination. In a quiet corner of an international airport, a new sign had gone up: Passenger Equity Office 24/7 Hotline, multilingual support, zero tolerance for discrimination. Next to it hung a framed quote, Dignity Boards First. Jay Price, a flight attendant newly hired, lingered at the sign on her break. She'd memorized every part of the new training materials. She'd watched the videos, heard the testimony, seen the before and after. What stuck with her wasn't the courtroom or the scandal. It was how a man responded to cruelty by building something instead of destroying everything. She whispered to herself, he didn't burn it all down. He redesigned the flight path. Back in Jonathan's office, overlooking a city bathed in golden dusk, he sat with Tyler. Now 17, Tyler towered over his godfather, his freckles faded, but his voice more sure. They asked me to give a speech at school, Tyler said, about who changed my life. Jonathan smiled. Your mom's gonna cry. Tyler nodded. Probably. But I want to say this part right. Can I run it by you? He pulled a folded note from his pocket, cleared his throat and read, They say heroes wear capes. Mine wore a seatbelt. They say justice takes time. But I saw it take 10 minutes and in a lifetime. They say kids forget, but I never forgot who stood for me when no one else did. Jonathan's eyes welled, but he said nothing. Tyler smiled. Too much. Jonathan shook his head slowly. Not even close. The last echo of the case, the airline that once denied him water had rebranded. New name, new logo, new leadership. But Jonathan knew rebranding wasn't reform. So he sent one last letter, not to the board, not to the press, but to the cabin crew. It read simply, you have the power to change the experience of someone's life at 30,000 feet. Use it well. Jonathan Price. Late one night, alone in his home library, Jonathan pulled out a box. Inside were items not displayed: the original boarding pass, the bottle now empty but clean, and a photo of Tyler asleep on his lap from that same flight taken by a stranger who had whispered afterward, I'm sorry, I should have said something. He placed the photo gently beside the others. These weren't relics of pain. They were reminders. That silence is a choice, and so is courage. Jonathan exhaled slowly, staring out at the dark horizon lit by distant planes. He didn't need to be remembered. He needed the system to remember what he did. And it did. The final report from the U.S. Department of Transportation landed on Jonathan Price's desk with a soft thud. Bound in a deep blue cover stamped with a silver seal, it was the culmination of 2 years of investigations, interviews, audits, and legal scrutiny. A 478-page document tracing not just the flight where everything changed, but the entire arc of a hidden culture that had once been protected by silence and profit. Jonathan ran his hands slowly over the cover. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He knew what it said, what it had to say. And more importantly, he knew what it now meant for every passenger, every employee, every silent victim who had once been told they were overreacting, that they were too sensitive, that they didn't belong. Now federal law bore his fingerprints. The new Passenger Dignity Act, co-sponsored by 3 senators and drafted in part by his foundation, had passed with a rare bipartisan vote. It mandated third-party oversight in all reported in-flight discrimination claims. It stripped immunity from flight crew members who acted with proven prejudice, and it guaranteed whistleblower protections for airline employees who spoke out. It was the kind of change people thought couldn't happen, but it did, and it started with one bottle. A documentary titled Flight Path, the Jonathan Price story, premiered on national television 6 months later. Unlike the viral clips or courtroom footage, this wasn't sensational. It was quiet. personal, uncomfortable in all the right ways. One segment featured the janitor who had cleaned up after the press conference, where Jonathan made the airline executives drink the foul-tasting liquid. His voice trembled as he spoke. I watched him walk off stage after all that, and he didn't look angry. He looked tired, like someone who didn't want revenge, just truth. Another scene followed Linda Alvarez, the university professor whose brother had been mocked by crew staff. I used to tell my students that justice was a theory, she said. Now I point to Jonathan Pryce and say it's a choice. The final moment of the documentary showed Jonathan and Tyler walking through the now renovated terminal where it all began. A permanent exhibit lined the walls, photos, letters. In the very bottle Jonathan had been handed, now displayed under thick glass with a simple black caption, "He drank their hate, they had to swallow the truth." 1 year later, the Tyler Foundation announced it had provided legal aid to over 5,000 passengers. In cases ranging from forced removals and silent profiling to unjustified flight delays linked to discrimination, their record was clear. Systemic issues don't fix themselves. They're forced into transformation. And now they had a playbook. Companies were listening too. Fortune 500 CEOs quietly requested meetings with Jonathan. Some wanted guidance. Others wanted the association, the credibility his name carried. Jonathan made time for the sincere ones, the ones who asked, how do we make this right instead of how do we make this go away? He refused to consult for companies that merely wanted optics. He demanded outcomes. In his private study lined with books about leadership ethics in the civil rights pioneers who shaped the path before him, Jonathan began writing his next book, Tidal Altitude and Equity Rebuilding Systems at 30,000 feet in ground level. The first line, I never wanted to be known for a lawsuit. I wanted to be remembered for the future it built. His voice in the book was different than in interviews, softer, reflective, less fire, more ember. He talked about the loneliness of the fight, the nights where doubt screamed louder than conviction. He described the toll on his body, his marriage, his business, but he also wrote about the look in a young girl's eyes when she told him, I want to be a flight attendant like the ones you helped train. He wrote about dignity, not as a slogan, but as an operating system for society. By the time the FAA announced its new internal division, the Office of Passenger Equity and Civil Oversight, the headlines no longer featured Jonathan's name. And that was fine. That was exactly how legacy was supposed to work. He didn't need credit. He needed change to last longer than memory. On a quiet morning 2 years to the day after the flight that changed everything, Jonathan visited the terminal once more. It had changed. The gate desk had new uniforms. The crew had new scripts. There was a digital feedback system embedded into the kiosk. Nearby, a child clutched a stuffed airplane pointing to the exhibit of Jonathan's case. A mother knelt beside the child and whispered, because of him, people pay attention now. Jonathan watched from a distance, sunglasses hiding his eyes. He didn't approach, didn't need to. He turned and walked toward the security checkpoint where a TSA officer caught his gaze and gave a quiet nod of respect. Mr. Pryce, he said, thank you for not letting it slide. Jonathan gave a faint smile. I couldn't afford to. As he disappeared into the crowd of travelers, one thing became crystal clear. He never wanted to become a symbol. But in refusing to be broken, he became a blueprint, a roadmap for what happens when silence meets resolve, when humiliation meets vision, when cruelty meets consequences, and when justice finally meets the skin. If you found this story powerful, subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more narratives that expose injustice and celebrate quiet revolutions. Together, we turn truth into impact.